So when you went to the trading post, it was like the equivalent of a Walmart store to the Plains Indians, or a big mall, and that you might go to a mall today. In other words, you could get everything there you wanted. You could get metal tools, knives, arrowheads, axes, metal kettles, mirrors, paint from China, jewelry from France, and like I said, and things coming from all over the world. And it was actually a huge business trading with the Plains Indians. The biggest problem all the traders had was the transportation cost of getting all these items up to the Plains Indian people, because it was very expensive to have all these things shipped anywhere back in the old days, just as it is today. And so what you wanted was something that was very small and something that was very lightweight, something the Plains Indian people couldn't make themselves, and something they would pay just about anything to get. And metal arrowheads were one of the very first things that the white man came up with that fit all those things. In other words, this is very small, it's very lightweight, something they couldn't make, and something they would give just about anything to have. I know you'd probably expect to see the stone arrowheads like this that you can still find today, and Plains Indians used them, and they would find them that were made maybe 500 years or more ago, and they would still find them, make them, put them on an arrowhead, and use them. But just as common would be an arrowhead, if they made it themselves, not one out of metal, would be one made out of bone like this. Here's a bone one, this is a stone one. Then the metal arrowheads were actually very common and very popular, and they are very far superior to a stone or a bone point, and that's why the Plains Indians wanted to use them. You could generally get 10 metal arrowheads pre-manufactured by the whites for one buffalo robe, which had the equivalent value of roughly about $35 per arrowhead, if you put it in modern terminology, modern money-wise, like that. And then I'll tell you some more about the arrows and some of the weapons in a bit. But I'm going to now show you a few more, unusual things that came from the white man, or the Euro-Americans, that you probably wouldn't expect. One thing that really surprises a lot of people is you see the Indian breastplates like these. You see them in movies all the time. You see them in paintings all the time. Modern Indian wear them all the time. But we know for a fact that previously to the late 1840s into the early 1850s, these were a relatively unknown item whatsoever. And they were an introduced item manufactured by the whites, by Jonathan Campbell and Company in New Jersey, and they actually made the individual pipes, and the Indian people would construct them into whatever they wanted, like in a breastplate like this. And it was really more of a symbol of wealth than it was something to be worn in battle to protect yourself from. And a lot of them in the earlier days were actually made out of shell, conch shell, and not made out of bone at all, like this one's made out of bone here. So they were basically a symbol of wealth, an item introduced by the whites because they thought it was something they could make money off of with the Indians, and it turned out to be just that. Mirrors, of course, were another big trade item that Indian people loved. Now, in movies, they'll always show you the Indian the very first time he looks at a mirror and he sees himself. Oh my gosh, I've never seen myself ever in my life before. But the truth is that anytime any Indian went to the creek or a lake or a pond, he saw a perfect reflection of himself, just as clear as if it's in a mirror. So that's another one of those things. Looks good on TV. They were never surprised to see themselves in a mirror. They might like how clear it was and how much that it was transportable and they could move it around and take it with them. But they knew what they looked like. They'd seen themselves plenty of times before. So. And the mirrors might be taken and made into like a large board like this with a point on the end, and that way it could be driven into the ground, because as I'm sitting on the ground right now, everything you did in the teepee was at ground level. So this mirror would be able to be used at ground level too, by just shoving it into the ground, and then you could look at yourself in the mirror just like that and put your paint on or whatever, do your hair or whatever. So that was another, mirrors were a very popular introduced item, as well as what were called burning glasses. Now, burning glasses are nothing more than a magnifying glass, and they came in many different types of forms and shapes and sizes and everything, but this particular one is like encased in bone, has like a little bone container. You see it goes back in there to help protect it. And Indian people loved burning glasses, and the main thing they used them for was starting fires and to light their pipes with. And Indian people smoked tobacco, and they were the first people to grow, cultivate, and smoke tobacco and spread it to the rest of the people around the world. And even they knew back then that smoking tobacco was really bad for you, and it was really bad for your lungs. And they tried to encourage their young men that were going to be the warriors and protectors of the people to only smoke ceremoniously. And that meant that they had two different ways that they smoked. They would smoke tobacco because they were addicted to it and they enjoyed the flavor of it. in very small pipes that were not considered sacred at all. And that might be just like a pipe, like one of these smaller pipes like this. Or they might have what people today would call the peace pipe, which would be the very large, long ceremonial pipes with a very large stone bowl carved very ornately. And they would only use those for very special religious practices. So it's hard for us to imagine today, in people's modern religion today, incorporating something like tobacco into a religious ceremony. But Indian people believed, and you have to remember, a lot of Indian people today still believe a lot of these same things. And whenever you're talking about religion, any religion at all, there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of variations. So the things that I say about religion aren't going to hold true for every Indian and every tribe all across North America. But generally you believe that God, the Great Spirit, whatever you want to refer it to, like tobacco also. And so when you smoke it ceremoniously in a ceremony, a religious practice, you're actually preparing the tobacco, and you might have a board like this. It could be even a buffalo shoulder blade like this one. And we showed you earlier how a buffalo shoulder blade might be used as a plate. Well, this one has been turned into a ceremonial tobacco cutting board. And this is how you could get the tobacco from the trading posts a lot of times. And even though Indian people continued to grow their own native tobacco, they preferred the white man's tobacco that was grown like in Virginia and North Carolina, because it was cured, it was sweeter, it was much moister than the tobacco that they grew themselves. But the tobacco board and all the little tools in it were used for mixing up all the different things you might be smoking. And then they would take a knife, or maybe a stone knife or a stone arrow like this, and chop it up. So after you had chopped up your tobacco mixture, which would be tobacco, it might be the white man's tobacco, it might be your own native tobacco. You might have some bearberry leaves in it, which is a plant that grows out here that has a pleasant taste. Tobacco root, there's all kinds of things, that red willow bark, the inner bark of red willow. But whatever it was, since they did not have Ziploc baggies or anything to keep it very fresh and moist, most all the tobacco and anything they smoked was going to become very dry in a very short period of time. So they would take a piece of buffalo back fat, and this is fat right off the buffalo's back, and you can cure it in the sun and it'll never spoil. And you can see it's just like a big white piece of it's kind of like hard Crisco or something. So they might rub this tobacco, this grease here, this back fat first with their fingers like that. Then they would take their hands once they were greasy, and they would mix their tobacco with the greasy hands, and then that grease going onto the tobacco will help it burn better. And again, I can't say enough that they knew tobacco was bad too. And I'm only showing you all of this because it is a part of Indian culture both today and in the old days. And it's important that you realize that it did play a big part in their life, even though, I don't want to encourage anyone to smoke today, of course. So, some more introduced items from the white man, which you'd probably be, surprised, is that they sometimes would obtain what are called ledger books. And the ledger books are simply a white man's book that he's used for business accounts to write his various business practices in, just like this one. And they could get these blanks. Sometimes they'd get them already filled out. And then what they would do is you would go in, and you could color in. You could using either regular colored chalks, colored crayons, colored pencils, or watercolors, all of which were available at the trading post. And you can see this is just like kind of like a modern colored pencil set that you could get today, that they would have, that they could get at the trading post, and that's exactly what they would use to write with and draw with in these books. And what they were doing is they were drawing in these books the exact same designs that they'd seen that they'd drawn on the teepee covers before, that we were looking at when we showed the teepee liner. And these would be their war exploits and the various things that they had achieved in battle and bravery. Show their bravery and their different war honors that they had accomplished. Sometimes they would pass it around and let other men draw in them, so it might not always look exactly the same because there'd be different men drawing different pictures in them. And it was just an easy way for them to store their pictures that they wanted people to know about what they had done. During the historic period that we're talking about, in other words, while Indians were still living in buffalo hide teepees and still going to war, and were not living on the reservation, in other words, almost exclusively all the drawings they did were about warfare. And of course there's going to be exceptions to that, but most of the things they drew were showing you the main thing they wanted to know. the people that they had conquered and the victories that they had achieved. They very rarely showed things like domestic scenes like cooking around the fire or going on a date or just riding their horse for pleasure. It was almost always just related to warfare like that. Another item, and this of course, like some of the things, it wouldn't be the most common thing that every Indian would have by any means, of course, but it wouldn't be anything that they would be that shocked if they walked in a teepee and saw. And these boxes like this were contracted right by the United States government, by the Indian and the War Department, which it was then, and they were made specifically for chiefs because they knew that when he came to talk, whether it was an Indian talking to another Indian from another tribe, they would give gifts back and forth. And that exact same thing goes on today. When dignitaries from different countries get together, a lot of times they'll present the visiting dignitary with something from their country. So they had these boxes made specifically for Indian chiefs, and you had a little drawer where you could put all your different jewelry in it like this. And it actually had a lock and a key, had a mirror that pops up so you can put your paint on and look at yourself and do your hair. Then when you're done with it, this closes down, and it's made so that once the lid is closed, the drawer will not open. It's locked. It locks itself once that's up. And the only way to open the drawer again is to lift the lid back up. See? That comes open just like that. So this would be something that only a chief would have probably had, or someone that had, done negotiations with the whites and had been given tobacco. Another trunk, or another little container that was very popular with them, and they could get at trading posts, or what they called cassette trunks like that. Like today we have cassette tapes. Well, this is a cassette trunk, and that it's a very small little wooden trunk. It's usually covered with horsehair and then brass tacks. And these were made by the whites for white people, but then once they realized that Indian people liked them, they became another popular trade item. So again, most Indian people probably wouldn't have a cassette trunk, but lots of them did. And if they saw one sitting in a teepee, they wouldn't be wondering, well, what the world is that? Because it was something they would have already been fairly familiar with. Then another unusual item that they actually made quite a bit of use of were spyglasses. And see, this is a white man's spyglass, or telescope, but it's mainly what they would call spyglass back then, like a binocular, but you can look through it like this. And Indian people knew that the white man used this to see through, to look long distances away. But what a lot of them related it to actually was more of a badge of rank. In other words, whenever they saw a white man with a telescope or a spyglass like this, they knew that that guy was the leader, because amongst the whites, only the leaders carried this, whether it was a surveying party, whether it was soldiers, whether it was trappers, traders, whatever. Generally, only the leader would have this. So an Indian man that considered him a leader, himself a leader, this would be something he would want to get. Whether he ever looked through it or not, to look at something far away, he would have it just as a symbol and just as part of his rank, so to speak, as being a leader, and therefore he too should have one, since the white man leaders had one as well. And they would use them to look through for far away too, but the optics on these old telescopes are so poor that I think half the time you can see better with just a bare eye if you have good eyes. More introduced white items. This is like a little small keg, basically like a wooden canteen that they could have, that they could carry water in or whatever. So, as I was saying, Indian people always accepted white man's goods, and they loved the white man's goods. They loved everything they could get from the white man, and even within the most religious items they owned, like their medicine bundles, which were like these containers here that they would keep all their religious items stored in, and when you look at old ones that are very, very old, inside they'll just have, tons of cloth and tons of metal and beads and bells and all kinds of things from the white man. So that alone shows how they thought about the whites, and that they were still willing to take those items and incorporate them or make them right into their most sacred items. So even their most sacred things didn't have to be totally traditionally Indian for them to be sacred to them, or special in any. Another little container. So on those medicine bundles are the things that they kept their religious items in. I mean, like I was saying, that anything whatsoever could be viewed as a religious item in some context or another, so many, many different ways. And any container or any item whatsoever could be used to keep stuff in. And you can see this one is actually a horse's head. And it's a real horse's head. Here's his nose and his mouth. Here's his ears up here. There's his mane. And where his eyes were, I beat it over. And on the back you can see it laces up. You can open it up and actually get in there. And so inside of there would be more religious items. Now, one made out of a horse's head actually could be almost anything. Since it is a horse's head, it might have been used by the equivalent of an Indian veterinarian, because they had men that actually specialized in doctoring horses. So maybe this was a veterinarian's medicine bag. Or it might have just been a man that that his spiritual power was associated with horses, maybe in a dream or a vision, which you believed was a way of God trying to tell you something in your dreams or visions. He had seen a horse, and his horse is the one that told him the words from God. And so he might have used a horse's head. Or the horse also represented wealth, because the more horses you had, the wealthier you were. So this might not be a doctor's bag. It might not have anything to do with a man that dreamt about horses. It might just be a man that made his medicine bag out of a horse because he wanted to be wealthy and he wanted the power of horses brought to him. That they kept the same ideas and along the same lines of medicine, which is this is the Indian word kind of for like religious items. Pretty much all over North America, all native peoples from all the different tribes saw bears as associated with healers and like doctoring and the ability to heal, the healing power. And a couple of reasons they thought that, like this grizzly bear hide I have here, is that bears have a huge layer of fat underneath their skin. So when they're wounded, they generally won't bleed on the outside. They'll be bleeding on the inside, and they may very well bleed to death inside. But you generally won't see any wound on the outside of them because the fat closes that wound up, and they saw that as an ability to heal wounds. They also saw that when the bear comes out of hibernation in the spring, his body is very depleted of all the nutrients and vitamins that it really needs to live off of for the coming year. So bears, as soon as they come out of hibernation, they go around and they dig up all the roots and berries and dried leaves and dried twigs and dried rose hips and cherries and everything they can, because they're trying to replenish their body with all that stuff in the early spring. Well, the Indian interpreted that by watching that over thousands of years, by watching that different through time. They saw that as the bear more or less being what people today call a medicine man or a holy man of the animal kingdom, and that the bear was actually collecting all these herbs and all these things, and he was using those herbs to doctor other animals within the animal kingdom. So if you were an Indian doctor, you would take on the personality or the persona of the bear when you were going to heal people sometimes, and you might have like a grizzly bear hide like this, like I said, and you can see the color of it. It's not a brown or a black, and it's actually the color of the prairie grass, and that's why it's this golden color, because originally the grizzly bears lived out on the prairie. They didn't live up in the mountains in the old days as much. You'd spot them right out on the prairie, just like you would a buffalo or elk. And elk today are the same way. Elk are this color because they're originally a plains animal. They originally didn't live up in the mountains, but of course they have to today because there's so many people living down on the prairie. So you might take this grizzly bear hide and put it over your head and have it hanging down your back. When you were going to go doctor someone, you might even have like a pair of grizzly bear moccasins. See, these are a pair of moccasins. There's the bottom, but they're actually made out of grizzly bear feet. There's the whole grizzly bear foot with the grizzly bear's claws left on there. See? And of course they would only wear these on ceremonial occasions. They wouldn't wear these just walking around camp or to go hunting in or anything else. They would wear these just for that. Then you may have a grizzly bear's skull that you might incorporate in some of your healing ceremonies. So here's a grizzly bear's skull. And you can see that actually the brain is very small and it sits way back in here and it's down. So when you really look at a grizzly bear today, and all the meat and all the fat and all the fur is on here, their head is huge, and their head goes way up here like this because they have a big blob of fat up here and a lot of fur on the front of their head. And so a lot of people think that the brain is located up in here. So when they shoot the bear to try to hit it in the brain, they're actually just going through a bunch of meat and fat and fur. Where, like I say, the brain is actually sits way back down at an angle, back off the back of the skull like this. And their skull is actually very flat, like a dog skull. And that looks exactly like a very, very large dog skull. There's hardly very much any difference in the dog and a grizzly bear, except that they're much bigger. So along this same line, grizzly bears, of course, also because of their huge size and strength, were also a symbol of power. And a symbol of prowess and, man's fighting ability and all. So grizzly bear claws were a very coveted thing, and they were very valuable. And you can see I have a grizzly bear claw necklace on now. And all the claws that they used were generally the front claws only. And I'll show you the difference in a minute between the back and the front. But this is just another variation of some very large grizzly bear claws. And they were very, very valuable back then. And we know for a fact that roughly around the 1850s or so, a lot of the Plains Indians had completely hunted out almost all the grizzlies. And at that time, a lot of the necklaces like these started to be made out of, instead of grizzly bear claws, they would make imitation grizzly bear claws out of bone and antler and horse hoof. So it would look almost like a real claw, but it wasn't. Then this is another one that'd be worn more like a choker, that'd be worn really tight up around your neck. And you can see the difference here in the little claws in between. These are the back claws. You can see the smaller ones. Those would be the rear claws. And then the front claws would be the larger ones. Huge size. So something that's always associated with Plains Indians, like teepees, horses, buffaloes, and bows and arrows, the other thing that a lot of people instantly think of being associated with Indian people. Now, even once guns were obtained, which was a very early date, the Plains Indians always carried their bows and arrows because they preferred to hunt with a bow and arrow. And also, even in war, even if you have a gun, there's going to be times when you're not going to be able to shoot at people because they're behind a rock, they're down in a ditch, they're down somewhere where you can't get them with a gun. But with a bow and arrow, you can shoot it straight up in the air and then drop the arrow right down on top of people. So they continued to carry their bows and arrows with them even once they obtained guns. And they preferred, like I say, to hunt with a bow and arrow because it's actually more efficient. You could load it much quicker than a gun, and it was much easier to kill a buffalo with one. And the ammunition for all the firearms was very, very expensive. So they preferred to reserve the ammunition mainly for warfare and not for hunting. And the ammunition was expensive for everyone. It didn't matter if you're an Indian or white or what. All ammunition in the early days of the West was very, very expensive because none of it was made here and had to be imported. All of it had to be brought in from an outside source. So, now this particular quiver here is made out of a mountain lion skin. And this would be one of the most highly prized and highly coveted and most expensive items that they had back then. And a mountain lion hide back then had the equivalent value of 30 tanned buffalo robes. So this is a very, very expensive item considering you can get a brand new gun at the trading post for 10 buffalo robes. So this was worth the equivalent of 3 guns just for this mountain lion hide here. And when the quiver was made out of a mountain lion hide, the quiver itself is where you keep your arrows. And you can see here's the tail of the mountain lion right there. They would leave that on there intact where it was originally. Then the cloth, the red wool cloth, comes from England, generally. All the glass beads came from Italy, and they were very expensive. And you'll hear people today say things like, well, they traded everything they had for a bunch of cheap glass beads. But the beads back then were very expensive due to the same thing as all this other stuff was expensive. They were glass, they were very, very heavy, and they were coming from thousands and thousands of miles away in Italy. So to get 10,000 pounds of glass beads from Italy to Wyoming territory, Montana, Colorado territory back then was a very, very expensive proposition for anyone trying to do that. So the beads were not cheap. Then when you made one out of a mountain lion hide, to case for the bow, and generally the quiver had a separate case for your bow. You had a case for your arrows and a case for your bow. And you can see now it's made out of a mountain lion's hide. See? The legs, I mean. Here's the front legs. There's the paw. There's one front paw. There's the other front paw with the paws and the claws left on it intact. Then you just sew the legs together in a tube like this, and then your bow will go right down in it. Then the strap that you have to keep it onto your body was made out of the mountain lion's back legs. And there's one back foot, and then you see it has a piece that comes and it follows the mountain lion's leg all the way up the belly like this, and then back down the other side, and that makes your other side of your strap there. And you can see how much larger the front paw is than the back paw. See how much larger that is? They're huge compared to the back paw. And most animals are like that, but not quite this exaggerated. Like horses' front feet are larger than their back feet. Buffalo's front hooves are larger than their back hoof. You get the idea. But a mountain lion especially is so much larger because their front paw is what they use to knock down game with. And even back then, their primary thing that they hunted was deer. You know, they hunted anything they could get to eat, but they mainly hunted deer. And they used the front paw just to knock the animal down with, and just to hold it down. And then they usually kill it by not clawing it to death or biting it 100 times, but generally just grabbing it right at the throat and biting down really hard and suffocating it. So it smothered it to death by closing its windpipe where it couldn't breathe anymore. And then the mountain lion's whiskers, like all cats have and everything else has, what those whiskers are is, at the end of each whisker on every animal, there's a huge bundle of nerves that's very, very sensitive. So those whiskers are telling them lots and lots of things. And the whiskers, one thing it's telling it, even if it's a cat today killing a little mouse, the whisker pressing up against the animal it's trying to kill will tell them the second that animal is really dead, because they'll feel that heartbeat going through that whisker, very sensitive. And when that heartbeat totally stops, then they know that animal is dead and they can release their grip up off of it. So, and generally, when you had a bow and arrow case like this, instead of putting it over your shoulder like you would imagine when you put it on over your shoulder. A lot of Indian men, since they had feathers in their hair, or they may have one of these headdresses on that they would be wearing, they'd actually hold it in front of them like this, and you would step into it. You step into it like this, and then you'd pull it up onto your body like that, and then up over your shoulder. And same thing when you took it off in reverse, they'd just step out of them like that. And that way they didn't have to mess up their hair, or mess up their feathers, or take off their headdress if they had one on. Then there are many items, of course, that a quiver could be made out of. And the ones that they actually used for hunting were very plain. They weren't ornamented with beadwork and quill work. These would all be very fancy quivers that would be used just for ceremonial occasions and for going to war. But another very nice quiver that would be very common was just one made out of leather like this, but with some beadwork on it. Then another very, very valuable quiver that they could have was one made out of otter. And you see this skin is an otter. An otter is very beautiful and it's very soft, and just like the mountain lion, this one's made with the otter's tail left intact. There's the otter's tail left on it. Then it's been backed with cloth and quill work has been put on it. And today people perceive the otter totally differently than Indian people did in the old days. Because today, due to Walt Disney movies and everything, we always see the otter as the most cute, playful, cuddly little creature there is on earth, and they love to play, and they do. They are very cute and they are very playful, but Indian people saw them for what they really were, which is like an ultimate predator carnivore. And otters are almost 100% successful when they go hunt. Now most animals aren't. People don't realize that. Now mountain lions today, we know, are anywhere from 87 to 92% successful when they go hunting. When you're talking about coyotes and wolves, they have a lot less success rate. And when you're talking about hawks, eagles, and owls, they're even much less successful than that. Less than 50% success rate when they go to hunt. So they saw the otter for what it was, a total killer. So the otter was generally reserved back in the old days only for men. Now that varied for some tribes in some areas, but it was generally an item only used by men. Now today Indian women wrap otter around their hair and use otter for different things, but in the old days an otter was generally a man's item only because it was associated with warfare and killing, and they usually didn't cross those lines between what men did, which was hunt and kill, and what women did, which was create life and create the family and create the home and create the dinner and create the food and all the creative, productive part of life, which is what the women represented. The demand for otter was so great amongst the Plains Indians that they almost completely trapped out all the otter in the West, believe it or not. I know that's hard to believe. And we always think of the fur trade back then going from west to east. In other words, there were trappers and Indians trapping animals out west in Montana, Colorado, Wyoming area, taking those hides to the trading posts. They were shipped back east and sold all over the world. But in the case of otter, as the 1860s and 1870s rolled on, and the otter became almost extinct out here, the otter were actually trapped in Kentucky and Tennessee and shipped west. So the otters were trapped there and shipped west specifically for the Indian market, because there really wasn't a white market for otters. So something that's